Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, March 26th, and today's lecture is about the Cold War and the decolonization period. This is going to stretch from 1949 to 1975. Just to remind you, World War II ended in 1945, so this is a few years after that. If you look here at the picture, you can see on the right the American bald eagle, which represents the United States, and on the left you can see the bear, which has the communism symbol, the hammer and the sickle. And just a little bit of background on the bear. So Russia was commonly referred to as a bear because it was big and kind of slow, although bears can be fast, by the way. But the Russians didn't like to be called a bear, and in fact their animal is also a bald eagle. So this cartoon is kind of poking fun at that. There's a big rift between Russia and the US. Remember, Russia in this period is the Soviet Union or the USSR. And in the rift, where you can see the divide in the ground, you have deepening suspicions. That's going to be kind of how you can summarize the Cold War. They're suspicious of each other. And the other little paper that's falling in the rift says irresponsible entanglements, or I might say engagements. I'm sorry, it's blurry. And that's basically saying that they are entangled or engaged in things that are not benefiting anybody. And we're going to talk about those things. So, some historical context for you about the post-World War II era. We can divide this into positive and negative. So negative would be like, aggressive rhetoric, the way that they talk about each other. Rhetoric is like dialogue or conversation, but it can include like writing, nuclear threats. We talked in the last lecture about how the use of the atomic bomb by the United States on Japan led to the nuclear age. And so what we're going to see is both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to build massive storage of these nuclear bombs, and we're going to call this nuclear proliferation. So the word proliferate means to have a lot of something, and it's like it's still expanding. Another negative aspect of the context is proxy wars that span the world. So proxy means to go through something or someone else. So for example, when we talk about proxy wars, we're saying that we're going to say the Soviet Union and the US did not fight each other directly. Instead, they fought through a proxy, such as Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea. And I'm going to go into detail through the lecture. We can also talk about communists versus anti-communists and how that created a lot of divides and tension. Some positive things you could talk about in this context include that the world has become increasingly interconnected. And because of that, we see an expansion in global trade. We're also going to see in this time period, colonized people are going to gain independence. And we also see that the United Nations promotes peace, human rights, and international cooperation. All right, there's a couple of organizations you need to be familiar with. They're probably listed on your vocab cards, and that's UNESCO, UNICEF, and the FAO. So UNESCO, you've probably seen this acronym if you've ever visited like a famous, site or architecture landmark. And they kind of give the labels to what is like the most important important cultural remnants that you can still observe today. UNICEF was created in order to help children in Europe after World War II during the rebuilding. Of course, today it helps children all over the world. And the FAO is the Food and Agricultural Organization. And you also have human rights. So this is added to the UN's goals in 1948, and what they were interested in doing and had concern with is war crimes, genocide, government oppression, as well as crimes against women. And they have their own court system called the International Court of Justice. And we talked about this when we talked about what happened with Nazi Germany afterwards, and also in Japan. Another part of the human rights advocacy includes the protection of refugees. So the UN today works with many organizations to help refugees with food, shelter, and medicine. For example, they helped the Palestinians when Israel was created, which I'll talk about later. You also have a Security Council. So the United Nations has several what we call organs or bodies. It's a very complex organization. And one of the most important ones is the Security Council. There are 5 members, permanent members on the Security Council, and there are 10 rotating members. And I asked you before, and I remember that most of you could name them. The 5 members you need to know include the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. Of course, Russia's the USSR, and of course, China is at first, for the first couple of decades, is actually Taiwan, and then later it'll be the People's Republic of China, which I'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. So, containment policy. You have the United States, who is anti-communist, and they want to contain communism. Contain means to hold, not to eradicate, not to eliminate, but to hold it in place. As you can see in the map, Stalin is pictured spreading communism into Eastern Europe, putting up little communist flags. And so what was happening was people believed that communism would spread and spread until it reached, all different parts of Europe, and then eventually to other places such as Asia. You also need to talk about Chinese nationalism in this time period. So one of the important things we talked about before was the first Chinese Revolution, which was in 1910, 1911. And that revolution ended 2,000 years of dynasties. We talked about the rise and fall of dynasties, but it's a continuity because you still had the dynastic cycle based on the mandate of heaven. So that ends and a republic begins, and it's led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, pictured on the top left. And he made an agreement with Russia that they would allow communists into the Nationalist Party, which in China is known as the Kuomintang Party. And the reason why is because they had a common belief, or a common enemy, I should say, anti-imperialism. In other words, they didn't want anybody taking over another country, specifically their country, China. So the party sponsored mass organization of workers, unions, peasant leagues, and women's association. So it was a lot about village life, everyday life, local issues. And then in 1925, Sun Yat-sen died and was then replaced by Chiang Kai-shek, who took control of the party, and he was not nice to the communists. He did not want to work with them. He saw them as a threat. He also wanted to revisit foreign concessions, meaning things that were allowed with foreigners. He wanted to go back to the table and look at those things. And in 1934, there's the New Life movement, which is based on diverse ideas, and there's also some fascism that is starting to pop up. And as we talked about in the World War II lecture, that the rise of fascism was common. All right, peasant populism. So we've talked a lot about the word populism and how people presented themselves as, I'm a common person. I understand what you're going through. I'm just like you. So the Kuomintang leaders, which is the Nationalist Party, they saw peasants as backwards. So they did not use the peasants as a base of support. And instead, the Communist Party are the ones who recruited the peasants and created this sort of grassroots movement. An example is White Wolf, which is kind of like the story of Robin Hood, but in China, and it gained a lot of popularity among the peasants. The idea from, steal from the rich, give to the poor, helping out the poorest of the people. But the Kuomintang Party did not use this moment to try to bridge together the peasants into the Kuomintang Party, and instead the communists were the ones who were able to do that, because the communists and the Kuomintang Party started to fight in China. Like I said, Chiang Kai-shek did not like the communists, and his army started chasing the communists, and they zigzagged across the country. At some point, it was like a 4,000-mile chase, and the communists would escape into the countryside, so that way they can avoid persecution. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang Party, their power were in cities. So the communists, they found their power in the rural or country areas. And so the communists learned that they could use the peasants as a loyal base, as a political force. So some of the things that they pledged was they would free China from colonialism. They also, their army had to respect the peasants and never steal from them. In fact, the army would help the people. The Communist Army recruited peasants into their army, and eventually a soldier in the Communist Army was more respected than a soldier in the Kuomintang Army. That's because the Kuomintang Party was dominated by scholars and by urban elites, and so being a soldier was not as respected. But in the Communist Army, it was. So, I mentioned earlier about that long march. Here I have that it's over 6,000 miles. And you can see on the map, they're zigzagging throughout China. And a lot of the areas they were going through included along the plateau and through the Gobi Desert. And I mean, these areas are very rugged terrain. By 1935, the Nationalist Party gave up. In 1937, the Japanese invade. And part of this was the nationalist troops offered Mao Zedong, who's going to lead the Chinese Revolution of 1949. He offers Mao Zedong and the communists to regroup. And the Japanese forces took the cities, but again, the communists maintained the countryside. So the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party under Mao Zedong are going to kind of joined together, sort of, to face a common enemy, which is the Japanese. So, what are some communist beliefs? They advocated lower taxes, cooperative farming, and policies aimed at helping women, for example, outlawing arranged marriages, as well as the legalization of divorce. And Mao Zedong really promoted women and their emancipation as a key component in building a new nation, which that has actually been proven true, that lifting up women lifts up everyone. Of course, a lot of his other policies faltered. So communist membership became very popular, and it started around 40,000, and by 1945 it was over 1,000,000. And so after Japan surrenders during World War II and begins to exit China, the fight resumes between the nationalists and the communists. So the communists receive arms from the Soviet Union. But communist China is like the little brother to the Soviet Union. The nationalists receive money and weapons from the U.S. So again, we're already starting that proxy setup, right? Where it's the Soviet Union versus the U.S., but they're doing it through China. Even with a lot of money and a lot of arms, the nationalists lost. They were very weak, and they escaped, and they fled to Taiwan. And when they went to Taiwan, they displaced a lot of the native Taiwanese people. And it was a mass exodus. And so, ethnically, Taiwanese people and Chinese people are the same. But there have developed differences over, the 75 years that they've been separated. In 1949, Mao Zedong announces China had stood up to the world and experienced a great people's revolution. The U.S. claimed, the nationalists didn't lose. Instead, they just disintegrated. There's Mao Zedong on the right. So, in early communist China, the revolution is from the bottom up, meaning organizing peasants, changing the way that they farm, moving them into cooperatives known as collective farming, as you can see on the bottom right, where you have a lot of people working one piece of land. They increase educational opportunities. At the same time, they're indoctrinating the youth, and workers were members of state-sponsored trade unions. In other words, all of these ways that they were able to supposedly gain rights, it was done through government programs. That means the government's in charge of directing how this is going to look, the vision. Anybody who criticized Mao Zedong was humiliated in public. They would actually have them stand on boxes, and people would walk up to them and yell at them in public. So there was public confessions, public humiliation. There was state-run heavy industry, so a lot of focus on steel and that type of manufacturing. And they used Russia as the example for communism, but they didn't do it exactly the same way. And it was a complete failure. And by 1957, Mao encouraged criticism. He said, okay, I don't think I did things right. Please tell me what I did wrong. And so critics, with his permission, started to criticize him, and they became known as rightists or experts. So, Mao Zedong is known as the chairman because he's the chair of the Communist Party. And so Chairman Mao's programs in 1958 include the Great Leap Forward, which is actually, you could call it the Great Leap Backwards. He organized China into communes, as I talked about, And I told you they focused on like heavy manufacturing, but a lot of that was done individually. Imagine you trying to build steel in your backyard, and you're trying to make something with it with another neighbor's steel. It's going to be different quality, different. It's not going to be the same as, if it's done in a factory. And so there was a lot of inferior goods, um, because a lot of farmers were forced to make steel and a lot of factory workers were forced to farm. There was a mismatch in, the experience people had in their jobs, and they were all of a sudden doing a different job. And so somewhere around 30 million to 45 million peasants died of malnourishment, mostly because of the loss of property rights. In a communist society, all the land is taken under the government. There's no private property in a communist society. So whether you had, half an acre or you had 100 acres, it was all taken. And because of that, people did not have that safety valve that they're able, even if you're the poorest person, if you at least have a little piece of land, you can grow some food. Also, 80% of the forests were cut down for fuel, and the focus was on socialist willpower. That takes us to 1966, the Cultural Revolution. So Mao Zedong organized 10 million young people into what is called the Red Guard. And he had them wear uniforms, and they had to carry around a little red book. These young people participated in rallies. They pledged to clean the party of corruption and to remake Chinese society. And so they wanted to get rid of the 4 olds. That is, old customs, old habits, old culture, and old ideas. So this army of youth went around China destroying homes, libraries, museums, and temples. They were anti-American, and they were also anti-Soviet revisionism. In other words, they were not going to be in the same category as the Soviet Union. They were making their own way with communism. And by 1968, China was in chaos. So Mao Zedong was convinced to step down, although he was still powerful. And this term is no longer used. But what we saw was the creation of the Third World. Today, we call these countries LDCs, least developed countries or lower developed countries. And so, if you look here at the image, you can see the people look happy. They're each represent a different occupation. Like everybody has a job, everybody has a role in society. In the back right, you can see the factories. In the back left, you can see the trains, all representing innovations. All right, what happened after Mao Zedong? So Mao's power was weakening, but kind of who took over was known as the Gang of Four, and one of them was his wife. And they tried to restart the Cultural Revolution. And if you remember, I was talking about the people he allowed to criticize him, the rightists or experts. One of them was Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping will be the next chairman. In 1976, Mao dies, and Deng Xiaoping's faction takes power. And he opens China's economy up and market up to the world. That is not communist. In a communist society, in a true communist society, you do not trade on the global market. You do not have very rich people. But Deng Xiaoping allows this. And he does this to save China. Either way, what we do know is tens of millions of people were killed, either directly or through government action or inaction. Government-induced famines, for example, during both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So we're going to change gears. All right, 1950s Cuba. So Cuba is a cosmopolitan area representing both African and Latin culture because of colonialism and imperialism. The American mafia controlled casinos. There was a lot of dictatorship under Fulgencio Batista, and this dictator restricted his people's freedom, but he was very friendly with American business. And so the Cubans didn't really like that because they felt that he had America's interest instead of the Cubans. Fidel Castro. He was born into a middle class family. He renounces his privilege, and in 1953, he leads an attack on an army barrack and he's put into prison. He's released a couple years later, and he goes into exile in Mexico, where he forms a rebel army. And he meets somebody there and becomes friends with Che Guevara. And I'll be talking about him more later. So Fidel Castro returns to Cuba, and he begins attacking police stations and military barracks again. And it's a sort of guerrilla warfare, and he's kind of coming down from the mountains and then going back to the mountains and hiding. And on New Year's Day, 1959, Castro and Guevara, they took the capital, and Batista fled. So one of the things happened was they toured Washington, D.C. and New York to get support. But the U.S. was unhappy with the so-called agrarian law. In Cuba, what they wanted to do was to take away American-owned land and give it to the poor Cubans. And of course, American business leaders, they didn't want their land taken from them. And if it was, it should be, they felt that it should be fully reimbursed for this. So pro-Batista forces escape to the U.S., and while they're in the U.S., they're lobbying the U.S. government, help us, we want to take back Cuba, they want a counter-revolution. And so Castro focuses on the defense of the revolution. In other words, he needs the revolution to stay alive so he can stay powerful. And so he looks to the Soviets for help. Meanwhile, Castro nationalizes, which means puts under the government, the sugar industry. And again, that was largely American owned. Bay of Pigs, 1961. You've probably heard of this. Maybe you don't know the exact events that happened. So JFK half-heartedly supported a group of Cuban exiles. So there's this plan by exiles in Miami who want to retake Cuba. And it was a failed invasion. And what happened, there was a timing issue, and this validated Castro's mistrust of the U.S. Then he was able to say, yeah, see, they're trying to invade us. They're trying to end our revolution, our great revolution. The U.S. places an economic embargo on Cuba, which actually stays all the way until about 2015 or 2016, when President Barack Obama lifts the embargo. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. So Cuba befriends the Soviet Union. They're friends now. And the Soviet Union wants to put missiles in Cuba because Cuba is about 90 miles from Miami. And they want to have missiles there, in the event that the U.S. attacks the Soviet Union. They have a location close proximity that they could attack the United States. So this is Cuba's first provocation, right? They are provoking a possible war. So the U.S. was planning an invasion, and the Soviet Union, pressured through diplomacy and militaristic threats, they went ahead and withdrew the missiles In return, the U.S. had to withdraw missiles from Turkey because there was a border shared with the Soviet Union. In other words, the Soviet Union tells the U.S., if you want us to take our missiles out of Cuba, you have to take your missiles out of Turkey. We call this brinkmanship. If you've ever heard of the game Chicken, where two cars drive to each other and whoever swerves is the chicken, that's brinkmanship. In 1963, they set up a telegraph, or what you can call a teleprinter hotline between the U.S. and the USSR. And it's basically a direct phone. They pick it up and it only calls one place. And they answer and then they can talk directly to avoid war. So pictured here, you see President JFK sitting on a nuke, and you see, I believe that might be Gorbachev or Khrushchev, one of them, and he's wrestling. They're arm wrestling, right? That's that brinkmanship. So, some changes in Cuba. So the Soviets. So we already said that the Cuban government, the communist Cuban government, takes over the American sugar industry. But the problem is they don't have any buyers because of the embargo that the U.S. placed. Basically, the U.S. told all of its friends, don't buy anything from Cuba. Don't trade with them. So the Soviets, they purchased the Cuban sugar, and they purchased it above market value. In other words, let's say it was supposed to cost, 25 cents a pound. They might pay 30 or 35 cents, so above market value, and that's a form of a subsidy, which helped cover the cost of transforming Cuba into a communist society. And at first, the Cuban Revolution was more populist based, but eventually it becomes more heavy on Marxist ideology. So Cubans were living better than before the revolution. Now they had food and better housing. They had access to medical care, and literacy increased. But it only goes so far, right? Because the country itself is not going to industrialize. Is going to be the problem. Cuba was still struggling economically because it relied on that economic dependency, producing mostly primary goods like sugar and tobacco, and then having to import higher costing manufactured goods. Cuba wasn't doing well politically either. There was low morale. The bureaucracy proved inefficient. There were low wages, shortage of goods. And Castro often gave these really long speeches. He loved talking. He especially loved talking to women. And critics of the revolution were sent to prison camps based on the Soviet model of the gulags. So, again, a lot of some similarities there. All right, I mentioned this, I believe, before. This is the so-called Iron Curtain, which was coined by Winston Churchill, if you remember, which he was the Prime Minister of the UK during World War II, and it's a metaphor. Iron Curtain doesn't actually exist, but it's a metaphor that describes the ideological split between Eastern and Western Europe. Looking here at the map, you can see NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance of the U.S. and European democracies. Because they formed, and that's in yellow, because they formed their alliance, the Soviet Union says, hey, I can make an alliance too. And so they start the Warsaw Pact, and that's there in the green. All right, Berlin Airlift and the Berlin Wall. So the Soviet Union pushed the boundaries when they blocked West Berlin. So if you see on the map here, Germany after World War II was divided into quadrants, which is four. You have in purple is the U.S. military has occupied the area in purple. The British has occupied the area in orange. Um, the French occupied the area in green. And the Soviets occupied East Germany, which is in blue. All right. On top of that, if you look at Berlin, where all the arrows are pointing to, and there's another little square that says, let's see, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but this little insert here, it's zooming in on Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, but it happens to be in East Germany. But because it's the capital, it was also divided into four. So what was happening is people were escaping from East Berlin and going to West Berlin, and because there was more opportunities and better standard of living in West Berlin. So East Berlin, what they do is they block the area from allowing food in and resources. And so the Allies have to airlift the food in. And they were able to defeat the blockade by airlifting the supplies, as you can see the plane on the bottom right. So the Soviet Union responds by building the Berlin Wall, separating East Berlin and West Berlin, and that wall will stand for about 30 years. So because of this, the West turns to Yugoslavia and provides a lot of aid, and that makes the Soviet Union upset because it's a communist country, and they convince them to sign a defensive agreement with Greece and Turkey. Not necessarily with NATO, right? They didn't fully become an ally, but it was against the Warsaw Pact. So here's the communist countries after World War II. There's a list there, and there they are on the map. Post-World War II economic recovery. There's a list of countries that had a fast recovery. In fact, Japan, we call it the economic miracle. On the right, you have the areas that were slow recovery, mostly because they were in an economic dependency from the colonial period. So, a couple of things are created to help Europe. You have the European Economic Cooperation, which focuses on steel and coal and lowering tariffs. European Economic Community, which is the predecessor to the European Union. And it's kind of known as the Common Market, and it's created by several leading European countries. What Europe figured out is that because all the countries are very small, that Europe is fragmented, that they would have to team up together in order to try to compete with the U.S. on the global market. Because if you think about it, the U.S. is 50 small states, or medium, some of them large states like Texas. While Europe had to come together the way the U.S. did in order to, even compete internationally. And so by 1970, Europe overtook the U.S. in industrial production and expanded their community between all the way to 1995, and they continued prosperity, raised the standard of living, and increase in bureaucracy. So the Soviet Union economic conditions include everything's owned by the state, like I mentioned. The government makes all economic decisions, and we call that a command economy because the government is commanding what will be produced and for who it will be produced, which are your basic economic questions. So the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies, they were rich in natural resources. The Soviet Union has a lot of land, and because of that, there's a higher probability of resources. Um, they have an abundance of energy and a large population. They invest in heavy industry, technical and scientific education. But the problem that they have is they don't produce enough consumer goods. And so there's a gap in the standard of living because they don't have access to as many things as people in Europe and in the US have access to. Um, if the government is deciding, for example, how much toilet paper you need, you're going to run out. They can't predict that. If they're trying to, determine how many diapers, they're not going to do a good job. And what happens is people are running out of like basic goods. That includes farming. So, the Soviet Union competed with the U.S. to provide loans, grants, and arms at low prices to gain more allies. Even though they were not in an ideal economic situation to do that, they still did it at the expense of their own people. So, we call this area here on the map the Soviet bloc. And so, Soviet Union did not allow Eastern European countries to stray, and they blocked them from having, free and fair elections. In Hungary, there was an uprising where they tried to challenge the Soviet Union's control, and the Soviets in turn crushed the revolt. There was mass arrests and executions, and this kind of showed that the Soviet Union was not going to take no for an answer. This also happens in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So, as a superpower, the Soviet Union is very strict with its people. There's no freedom of speech, association, or religion. There's a lot of like secret police. The Soviets saw colonialism and imperialism as the barriers to liberation for third world countries, and that's kind of what they use to try to attract more countries to the communist side. And so they supported nationalists and socialists throughout the third world. In 1953, Stalin dies, and he's replaced with Khrushchev, who denounced Stalin's excesses. So people had hope that Khrushchev would do things different, but he really didn't. East Berlin was repressed. Catholics in Poland were oppressed as well. For example, in a 1956 religious gathering with over 1 million Poles, that's the name of people from Poland, it led to anti-government demonstration, and afterwards the USSR did loosen some policies, but they also made it clear that they were not going to cut ties. The U.S. is a superpower, so Americans are criticized by the Soviets. They criticize the Soviets for their harsh control, but the U.S. itself also displayed some of this, contradiction to their own ideology. In the 1950s, you probably heard of this. It's known as the Red Scare, and it was paranoia. And Senator McCarthy, this is known as McCarthyism, named after him. It's known as a political witch hunt, identifying people as communists. And so basically, Senator McCarthy and other people were like, naming all these famous people, politicians, celebrities, and, oh, they're communists. And so Americans started to see any government that was anti-communist must be good. However, several of the anti-communist governments were actually authoritative dictatorships that were not good. And in fact, they were being backed by the U.S. through the CIA. So, for example, in Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi, he had a close alliance with the Eisenhower administration. Also in Guatemala, a democratically elected president, Jacob Arbenz, they wanted to remove him from power even though he was democratically elected. So the U.S. was interfering in other countries' elections. The Korean War. So after World War II, Soviets occupied Korea north of the 38th parallel. That's the famous line that you know as the DMZ. and there was no agreement on elections. And 2 years later, North Korea invades South Korea. And so the UN Security Council, which remember I told you was five um, countries, they wanted to defend South Korea. And they did it on a day that the Soviet Union was not present because they know they wouldn't vote for this. So they fought until 1953 with the Soviet Union as the main ally on the north side, and South Korea's main ally was the United States. The U.S. didn't want to invade China as the Soviet Union would retaliate, so fighting remained along the 38th parallel, which is the DMZ. Now, the war never officially ended. It's sort of like a truce. Like everybody went home, and they just didn't show up again to fight. So there's no official treaty, and the line remains fortified as you know it as the DMZ. Japan's economy was stimulated by the war because they needed a lot of supplies. There was a lot of servicemen who were stationed there and who were spending money. So that's going to help jumpstart the Japanese economy. In French Indochina, the French had originally colonized as part of the civilizing mission. Remember, the French believed anybody could become French. So a lot of Vietnamese peasants lost land to French companies. By 1941, Japan invaded the area, and France couldn't do anything about it because it was occupied by Germany. At first, the Vietnamese welcomed the Japanese because they're like, oh, they're also Asian. They won't treat us this way. And in fact, they treat them even worse. So the Japanese occupation is what's going to increase Vietnamese nationalism. And so after World War II, the French wanted to reoccupy Vietnam. And the U.S. told France, this is a really bad idea. Everybody's letting their colonies go. They're granting them independence. Let them go. Ho Chi Minh, who was a rising leader in Vietnam, he asked the U.S. for help, but the U.S. would not help him because of his communist ties. So a little bit about Ho Chi Minh. He's educated in France. He joined the French Communist Party. He was committed to socialism. He fought against the Japanese. And he really, really loved his country. He was very nationalist. And he was also an intelligence agent for the U.S. during World War II. And he established a party called the Viet Minh in 1941. And they had two basic principles: free all of Vietnam, both North and South, from foreign rule, and establish a socialist government in Vietnam. So at the Geneva Conference, Vietnam was temporarily partitioned into North and South. The U.S. feared Ho Chi Minh would win national elections and unite the country under communist rule. So the U.S. supplies the South with weapons and training. North Vietnam sponsored a Southern-led rebel army known as the Viet Cong. If you've ever watched movies or documentaries from this time period, you'll always hear people saying, oh, are you Viet Cong? And that was known as the enemy. In 1964, President LBJ sent thousands of troops to Southeast Asia with the goal of creating a legitimate national government in southern Vietnam. There was a lot of bombings. In 1968 was the Tet Offensive, when North Vietnam attacks the South. In 1969 was the My Lai Massacre. This was a televised live television showing children who had been bombed. They were on fire. They were naked. And this was on TV. And it was transmitted all over the world. By 1969, people back in the U.S. were protesting the war. So, the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare. Their first principle is they're going to gain the support of the people. Like we talked about in China, Vietnam does the same thing. Recruit peasants, help the peasants. Their second principle is to fight in small units using hit and run tactics. So this is kind of similar to what I was talking about with Fidel Castro. And their third principle was to obtain help from other communist countries and to capture your enemy's weapons and use it against them. So, one of the reasons why Vietnam was so hard to win, which, by the way, um, the US did not win the Vietnam War, um, is because it's in a jungle, it's a tropical rainforest, and also there's a series of tunnels. So, what they would do is Vietnamese people are 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 usually shorter in stature and a lot thinner, and so they would make these really small um, holes in the ground, tunnels, and they would cover them. And it's kind of like you see in movies where somebody's walking and they fall into a hole and go down a elaborate tunnel system. And so the Americans didn't know where the tunnels were, but the Vietnamese, the ones who were fighting, did, and so they would, go into these tunnels, and so it was harder for them to, kill them with bombs and like that. In fact, they were just killing a lot of civilians, really. All right, U.S. opinion. So, um, originally the U.S. opposed France's recolonization of Vietnam. The U.S. had freed the Philippines in 1946, Britain freed India in 1947, and the U.S. Supported people who were seeking independence. But the U.S. opinion changed because of something called the domino theory. This is the idea that if one country falls to communism, they're all going to fall to communism. And you look at the picture on the left, China fell. Well, Russia fell, China fell. It's going to be Korea, Vietnam, and all. Who was going to be next. And so the U.S. justified its military involvement in Vietnam because of this. And this fear was increased when North Korea fell to communism in 1950, and then several other countries after that. And so the Americans began to support France against communist Vietnam, and communist Vietnam was backed by Soviet Russia and communist China. And so the Vietnam War was actually a regional conflict that turned into a larger war. France was losing to the Viet Minh, even with billions of US dollars. What was happening is like all the weapons that were purchased, the enemy was capturing them and then using them against the Americans and the French. And instead of, accepting defeat, France asks the U.S. for even more money. So the U.S. enters the Vietnam War in 1954. About 500,000 soldiers are sent to Vietnam. This led to a lot of protests back home in America, where tens of thousands of people fled the country to avoid the draft. About 250,000 didn't even register for the draft. People burned their draft cards. Not only were they sent to Vietnam, but also to Cambodia. And the U.S. Withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. Within 2 years, South Vietnam collapsed, and the communist North invaded the South and took it. And so, what was the point? Is kind of the question people were asking. On the top right, protest, right? Resist the draft, don't register. On the bottom right, there at the Washington Monument. So this is a little comparison chart on the left showing the number of deaths, the Union side of the Civil War, the Confederate side of the Civil War, compared to the Vietnam War. And on the right in the pie chart is the casualties of the Vietnam War. As you can see, about 5.6 million were Vietnamese. That was the number of deaths, and American was about 211,000. Here's a timeline of the Vietnam War. I recommend you print this slide out or draw it out, go over it carefully so that way you know, okay, this is the early Cold War, this is the brinkmanship when everything was really hot, and then, what are the specific things that happened in Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is a united country, North and South together. It's communist, and they have very little freedom in Vietnam. All right. Let's turn to the U.S. So the U.S. had its own problems, and trouble peaked in the 1960s, and because of the attacks on protesters, as part of the civil rights movement, it was gaining national attention, and so people were protesting segregation, police brutality, um, and the bottom left, what was happening was they were called freedom riders. Both black and white people would ride the bus together, activists, and they were attacked, and their buses set on fire for trying to integrate them. On the bottom right, you can see nonviolent, peaceful protesters who are just sitting on the sidewalk are being sprayed in very, very close proximity with high pressured water. In this picture here on the left, you could see again another part of the 60s was the protest against the Vietnam War. So the global attitude of the 60s was a triad. It was social, political, and cultural change. And economies were growing, but social inequality was declining. More people were being able to afford food and consumer goods. More people were entering college. And in many parts of the world, it was a full swing post-war recovery. Teenagers no longer had to start working very young. They could take time to find themselves, and they embraced their roots. And this is kind of marked by the hippie movement that began in the late 1970s. And some people were more like into spiritual practices. And there was also a major youth movement, which is also known as the sexual revolution, because of the debut of the pill, the birth control pill in 1960. Because of this technology, women gained more control over their family and their childbearing. In other words, how many children will they have? And a second wave of feminists started to demand equal rights. Here in 1968, again, there's a lot of student protests. 1967 was a year of art, music, love, and slogans, famously "Make Love, Not War." There was also a lot of drug use. A lot of peaceful protests turned violent. Two famous leaders were assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. as well as RFK. There were a lot of protests in Chicago where on live television, police were beating youthful protesters. There was also a protest at Kent State University where the National Guard in Ohio shot and killed 4 students. In 1968, President Nixon, who was a conservative, he was elected because people just wanted to go back to normal. In France, there was also a lot of protests in France, and a lot of college students were assaulted by riot police. And very similar, like the U.S., Charles de Gaulle was elected to return France to normal. In 1968 is a big year. There was revolutions in Czechoslovakia. There was what is known as the Prague Spring, where people weren't happy with the Soviet control. They went, there was a lot of protests, and this led to the resignation of communist leadership. And new leaders were promising, more freedoms and more of a market economy. And the Soviet Union sent in 500,000 troops into Czechoslovakia to replace the leader and to block reforms. In Mexico, society was rapidly changing, especially the youth. There were a lot of protests in 1968 because the elections in Mexico were not, a lot of times they were either not free or not competitive. They were like, there was election fraud. And in the Summer Olympics were supposed to be held in Mexico that year. And instead, what was happening was people were being massacred in some cases um, because of their protesting. All right, so again, I already talked about how the U.S. and the world enters the nuclear age and the arms race. And what I do want to point out is 1959, um, the world reaches a point called MAD, MAD, which stands for Mutual Assured Destruction. In other words, if we start sending off nukes, we will for sure kill each other. And the technology was these missiles, which we're going to call ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, meaning they can reach another continent. They became capable of delivering a warhead. In other words, they can attach, um, um, you know, a really strong nuke. And in 1963, there's an agreement on, where do we test bombs? There's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that countries signed promising that they're going to reduce the amount of arms that they're producing. And then here's a map showing you, who has arms. Countries like Russia, the US, France, China, the UK, but also Pakistan, India, which might be a little shocking there. And then they don't like each other, Pakistan and India, but also Israel, North Korea, Iran, and then here on the map, to the right of the map, you can see some of the different bombs. Space race. This is probably one of the most famous parts of the Cold War. So the Soviet Union launches the first satellite, Sputnik, into space, and the U.S. is embarrassed. So the U.S. hurries up and, sends men to the moon, and that's 1969 with Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin. So, again, proxy wars, here's how they're aligned. Blue is aligned with the U.S., red is aligned with the USSR. And nationalism in Africa, so as you can see in the map, but in 1945, at the end of World War II, it's mostly Africa and Asia where you have a lot of imperialism that is still happening, but many areas are agitating for independence. So in looking at the decolonization of Africa, we can first talk about South Africa, where Afrikaners, who were, if you remember, the Dutch who arrived in the 1600s, they're white South Africans, and they dominate politics, and they start a policy of apartheid, which is racial segregation between blacks and whites in South Africa. And so for 40 years, people live under this system. Nelson Mandela, he organized nonviolent protests just like the way Gandhi did. He was arrested in 1964, and he was in prison for almost 30 years until he was finally released, which I'm going to talk about him more in the next lecture. In Ghana, you have the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence in 1957. And we're going to have two kinds of independence. We're going to have negotiated, where you talk it out, and we're going to have armed, where you're going to fight. So Kwame Nkrumah is the first president of Ghana. He has public works projects. He's accused of putting the country into debt, though, and so this is going to be a common pattern among African dictatorships where, maybe they start out with a good vision and then it's just a lot of corruption. When democracies first start, they're very, very fragile, and it's easy for a military, for example, to take over the government. He promoted Pan-Africanism, which is basically, the cultural unity of Africans. And he founded the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. But he was overthrown in a coup in 1966, and many foreigners were expelled. And Ghana did not experience a peaceful transition of power until the year 2000. In Algeria was a French colony, and this is an armed struggle. Because France Just like they didn't want to let Vietnam go, they did not want to let Algeria go. Algeria was a settler colony where a lot of French people lived. And so Algerians have been campaigning for independence. They wanted equal rights to French settlers. So there was a movement called the National Liberation Front, FLN. And again, this is a violent independence movement beginning in 1954. France sends about 500,000 troops to fight the Algerians. Um, this is a really, really violent um, uh, war, because if a lot of the pictures that you'll find in this struggle includes like a lot of severed heads, and again, very, very violent. In 1958, French President Charles de Gaulle planned steps to free Algeria, and in 1962, Algeria was independent. In Kenya, Eastern Africa, it's a large population there. A lot of people went there for the railroad, in building it. Britain was the colonial power. Their official language was English, and in 1952 was the Mau Mau Terror, where people were protesting because of their economic conditions under the British, and this escalated into a civil war. But it was under control by the late 1950s. British compromise, and issued independence in 1963. And the British were embarrassed when it was revealed of how much they abused their citizens. Jomo Kenyatta is the first president, and he rules from 64 to 78. And his kind of rule is, first president, and there's one political party. He has a very, very famous quote, which makes me think of things fall apart. And his quote is, "When the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land, and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with their eyes closed. When we opened them, they had the land, and we had the Bible." In the Congo, King Leopold ruled the Congo with brutality. Upon independence in 1960, the Belgians allowed a weak Congolese government, and they did it on purpose because they hoped it would fail and they would call the Belgians back. The first government was formed by Patrice Lumumba, and at the independence ceremony, they thought he was going to say thank you, right, for independence and for everything the Belgians did, and instead he listed all the crimes that Belgium had committed in the Congo. So he was seen as a radical. And he has a famous saying. He said, "History will one day have its say, but it will not be the history that Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations will teach, but that which they will teach in the countries emancipated from colonialism and its puppets, a history of glory and dignity." So the UN responds by sending in peacekeepers because the government was falling apart. Lumumba believed that the West was just trying to get control of their mining interests, and so he turns to the Soviet Union for help. And of course, now he's called a communist. He was arrested, he was beaten, and he was murdered. The person who replaced him is Joseph Mobutu, who becomes one of the worst dictators ever. And he was a former CIA connection, and the U.S. gains, once Mobutu takes power, the U.S. gains rights to the minerals, and those minerals were needed for defense and aerospace industries, and more recently are needed, to make our phones. All right, the Bandung Conference of 1955. So leaders from Asia and Africa meet together in Bandung, Indonesia, to try to strategize how to avoid neo-colonialism. Like, how do you stay neutral? And so Sukarno from Indonesia, Nehru from India, and Nasser from Egypt were the three. And you can read the slide. There's a little bit about them. I'm going to talk about them more, I believe, on the next lecture. And here they are signing their peacemaking deal. And then there's the countries there pictured, um, shaded in orange, showing you who participated. These are the non-aligned countries, all the ones in blue. And the Helsinki Accords. This is an act that affirmed that no boundaries should be changed by military force. And this was developed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And we end with talking about how the Cold War goes from relaxed to dangerous. So between 1969 and 1979, Cold War enters a peaceful phase known as détente. And this is a period of relaxed tension. In fact, President Nixon visits the Soviet Union in 1972. You have the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT, to limit the number of ICBMs a nation can own. That's the intercontinental ballistic missiles we talked about in the beginning. Nixon also visits communist China, and the U.S. begins to sell grain to the Soviet Union. And so it seems like things are getting better, but the peace ends in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And I'm going to go into detail about this in the next lecture. So I'm going to end for today, and sorry if my voice sounded strange. I caught a cold or something. But thank you guys for listening to the lecture. Please make sure you go over it. I know it's a lot of information.